and he thinks that rhythm is the closest he can get to a sort of definition of what life is. And that the root principle of life, he says, is in some lowly form exemplified in all types of physical existence, like electromagnetic vibration is an example of rhythm, right? But he talks about rhythm in terms of a round of experiences. And this is where cycles come in. And he says that the cycle is such that its own completion provides the conditions for its own mere repetition. Its own completion provides the conditions for its own mere repetition. So there's something tautological going on there. It eliminates the fatigue attendant upon the repetition of any one of its parts. It eliminates the fatigue attendant upon the repetition of any one of its parts, which means that there's a difference. He wants to distinguish between the abstract structure of the cycle and the variation of the concrete details of succeeding cycles. So that there's, in any rhythm, there's not just complete repetition. That would be the way of blindness. There's a principle of variation, right? And he says that the cycle element is driven into the foundation, and variations of cycles and of cycles are elaborated. And so to the very base of existence is this cycling process, which is kind of spiralic because it's never the same twice. But, you know, when we think about what he might mean by something like the primordial nature of God, I think we need to read that more preformationist idea in concert with with what he's saying right here. The cycle element is driven into the foundation, which is to say that there's not really a foundation. The further back we go, we're just going to see more repetitions with a difference, you know, in like Deleuze's sense of difference in repetition. And so
it's a ramification in the sense that there are, like, I've thought about this in a musical metaphor in terms of, I don't like infinite, but, you know, infinite subdivisions of the cosmic beat, so to speak. You know, there's one rhythm that everything is in conformity with, the attractor, which is a dynamic conception of the primordial nature. And then there are, but you can infinitely basically subdivide a beat, right? You can always split a beat into, you know, other subdivisions, and you know, I mean, there's lots of musical juiciness we could talk about there, but yeah. No, I like that image a lot that he gives there.
Yeah, and this cycling and this way of rhythm, I think, is precisely where a general theory of evolution can come in, which is what I think Whitehead's trying to describe with his process of what he calls concrescence, where there is both a principle in concrescence, a principle of inheritance, a principle of variation, and a principle of selection, right? All just implicit in this idea of concrescence, which is itself, again, a cycle. And life, if we're going to understand how life originated, I think one of the ways we can approach that to make it more tractable is to imagine life as, in order to reach that bare minimum sort of lowest common denominator of survival, it needs to internalize the rhythms of its cosmic environment. And so, you know, 5 or 4.5 billion years ago, when liquid water first forms on the Earth, 4.3, 4.2, whatever it was, for life to emerge, it's made possible by the fact that the Earth is spinning, and you get the day-night cycle, and the moon is orbiting, and you get the tidal cycles, and you get these subtler cycles of, you know, the if the hot spring hypothesis is right and not the deep sea hydrothermal thesis, but either way, life is having to find a way to internalize all of these rhythms, and in some ways to become not autonomous from its environment, but to become a microcosm, right? To internalize those rhythms so that what was just happening in the environment, these various cycles, becomes a metabolic cycle that allows this form to maintain itself. And as soon as it maintains itself, it's then changing the environment that it had to internalize before, right?
One way of dealing with a complexity in your environment is to make some of it you, basically, is to enter into symbiotic relationships, to become some kind of that's one major pathway of complexification, obviously. And that, again, that complexification, which could be driven by symbiosis, can be driven by lots of different things, is itself driven by the complexification of the environment.
And so, yeah, I think there's a something that remains deeply relevant in what Whitehead is saying about cycles here. It's still relevant for thinking with, and I think the idea that no cycle is a mere repetition of the past allows us to understand not just change, but the, what he wants to call aim, which we don't need to think of in some magical, impossible to understand scientifically sort of way, but rather as just that, not just the ingression of novelty, but the ability to emphasize certain novelties, certain possibilities over others, because he's trying to balance efficient causation and final causation. He's trying to understand evolution not just as a push from behind, but that there's also this other factor, which is the lure from ahead. And we don't want to end up in a situation metaphysically where we have to understand these two forces as in conflict with each other, as if they're just two principles at war with each other. I think you kind of get that in Bergson, who's more comfortable with these dualisms, whereas I feel Whitehead always trying to arrive at contrasts and not conflicts between these ideas. And so again, concrescence seems to me to be his attempt to account both for that push from behind, physical feelings, as well as the pull from the future, foresight, which combines in every cycle. Right? There's an integration of these two influences in every cycle. I think is the best I can articulate what I feel is important about his concept of cycle in this text. Did I lose you for a second? I think your connection has gone bad.
Yeah, connection's just gone a bit funny. I really appreciate all of that. I mean, there are so many resonances there, and I know you've got to go, but even Dennett actually comes to mind in terms of his discussion of cycles within cycles, within cycles, within cycles, within cycles.